And before you stands something almost impossible to comprehend. A vast stone gallery stretching upward into darkness. Its walls rise above you. Its floor climbs steeply toward the heart of the pyramid. Massive limestone blocks form a strange, carefully engineered ceiling. There are no paintings covering the walls, no golden statues, no obvious treasure, just stone. And yet, this enormous passage may be one of the most mysterious spaces ever built by the ancient Egyptians. It is called the Grand Gallery. For thousands of years, people have asked the same question. Why is it there? Why would the builders of the Great Pyramid create such an enormous passage inside a monument that was supposed to protect the burial of a king? Was it part of a sophisticated engineering system? Was it connected to the burial chamber? Was it designed to help move enormous blocks of stone? Was it part of a mechanism intended to seal the pyramid after the pharaoh's burial? Or was it something even more complicated? Some stories claim that the pyramid contained deadly traps designed to destroy anyone who tried to enter. Others speak of hidden mechanisms, crushing stones, and supernatural curses. But the truth may be stranger than the legends, because the Great Pyramid does not need imaginary monsters to be terrifying. The real mystery is what the ancient Egyptians were capable of building. They created a monument so enormous that it still dominates the landscape of Giza. They transported millions of blocks of stone. They aligned the structure with extraordinary precision. They created chambers and passages deep inside a mountain of limestone. And they constructed the Grand Gallery with a level of engineering that continues to challenge our understanding. The people who built it left no modern blueprint, no instruction manual, no surviving explanation saying exactly what every passage was for. Instead, they left us the pyramid, a monument that has survived earthquakes, weather, war, looting, and thousands of years of human curiosity. And inside it is a passage that still refuses to give up all of its secrets. Tonight, we are going into the darkness. We will follow the path of the ancient builders. We will enter the Great Pyramid. We will climb toward the Grand Gallery. We will examine the strange architecture surrounding it. We will explore the ancient fear of tomb robbers. We will investigate the stories of traps and curses. And we will separate what archaeology actually tells us from what later generations imagined. Because there is one question that will follow us through this entire journey. If the Grand Gallery was built with such extraordinary effort, what was it built to do? This is the story of the pyramid's most terrifying secret, the Grand Gallery. Chapter 1. The Pyramid After Dark. The desert changes at night. During the day, the Giza Plateau can feel exposed. The sun hangs over the limestone. The stones glow beneath the heat. Tourists move across the ancient landscape. Cars pass in the distance. The modern city of Cairo stretches beyond the plateau. But when darkness falls, the atmosphere changes. The Great Pyramid becomes something different. Its enormous shape disappears into the darkness. The details of its surface become harder to see. The structure seems less like a building and more like a mountain created by human hands. For thousands of years, this monument has watched over the desert. Generations have been born and died beneath its shadow. Kingdoms have risen. Kingdoms have collapsed, languages have disappeared, religions have changed, cities have been buried, and yet the Great Pyramid remains. Its original smooth outer casing is mostly gone. Its summit no longer has its ancient capstone. Its interior has been entered many times. Its treasures, if they ever existed inside, are long gone, but the monument itself survives. And perhaps that is the first mystery. Why did the ancient Egyptians build something this enormous? The answer seems obvious at first. It was a tomb. The Great Pyramid was built during Egypt's 4th dynasty, traditionally associated with the reign of Pharaoh Khufu. Khufu ruled during one of the most powerful periods of ancient Egyptian history. The Egyptian state had enormous organizational abilities. Its society could mobilize workers, craftsmen, administrators, and resources on a scale that few civilizations of the ancient world could match. The pyramid was the ultimate expression of that power. But calling it simply a tomb does not fully explain what we are looking at. A tomb does not normally need to contain millions of tons of stone. A tomb does not need to dominate an entire landscape. A tomb does not need an internal architecture of such complexity. And yet, the ancient Egyptians were not simply building for the living. They were building for eternity. Death was not considered the end. The pharaoh's existence was connected to the stability of the kingdom and the cosmic order. The king's journey after death mattered. The burial had to be prepared. The body had to be protected. The rituals had to be performed. And the tomb had to provide a place where the dead king could continue his existence. This is why the pyramid becomes more interesting when we stop thinking about it as a pile of stones. It was part of a much larger religious and architectural system. The pyramid stood within a complex. There were temples, there were causeways, there were spaces connected to rituals surrounding the dead king. The entire landscape was designed around the royal burial, and somewhere within that enormous monument was the final resting place of the pharaoh. That raises another question. If the Egyptians believed the king needed protection after death, how could they protect his burial from the living? The answer was not simple, because the greatest danger to an ancient tomb was not always supernatural. It was human. Tomb robbers. Ancient Egypt produced enormous wealth. Royal burials could contain valuable objects: gold, precious stones, jewelry, ceremonial equipment, objects associated with the pharaoh's identity and status. These objects were intended to accompany the king into the afterlife. But to someone willing to violate the tomb, they represented something else. Wealth. A royal tomb could become a target, and this created a strange conflict. The ancient Egyptians wanted the tomb to be accessible enough for rituals, but inaccessible enough to protect the dead. They wanted the burial chamber to remain hidden. They wanted the entrance to be sealed. They wanted the monument to survive. And they wanted the pharaoh to remain undisturbed. The Great Pyramid, therefore, existed in a world where architecture and religion were deeply connected. A corridor could have a practical purpose. A chamber could have a ritual purpose. A stone block could support the structure, or it could help seal a passage. And sometimes we cannot easily determine where one function ended and another began. This is where the mystery of the Grand Gallery begins. The Grand Gallery is not hidden in some secret chamber beneath the desert. It is not a tiny tunnel discovered by accident. It is one of the most spectacular architectural features inside the Great Pyramid. It rises through the interior of the monument. Its dimensions are enormous compared with the narrow passages leading toward it. The contrast is striking. Imagine moving through a low corridor. Your shoulders nearly touch the walls. Your head is close to the ceiling. You continue upward. Then the space suddenly expands. The ceiling rises. The walls seem to climb toward you. The passage stretches ahead. The floor remains steep, and above you, layers of limestone create a remarkable corbelled roof. This was not an accidental space. It required planning. It required enormous quantities of carefully cut stone. It required the builders to understand weight, pressure, and structural stability. And it had to be integrated into the pyramid while the monument was still being constructed. That is difficult enough to understand. But the real mystery is why. What was the Grand Gallery supposed to accomplish? For centuries, explorers and scholars have proposed different explanations. Some have focused on its relationship with the king's chamber. Others have examined its structural properties. Some have suggested that it was connected to mechanisms for moving or blocking massive stones. Others have proposed religious or symbolic purposes. And popular culture has added its own stories. Secret traps, hidden machines, death mechanisms, curses, ancient secrets deliberately designed to frighten anyone who dared to enter. These stories are powerful, but they can also make it difficult to separate the real mystery from the imaginary one. The ancient Egyptians certainly knew about tomb robbery. They certainly took burial security seriously. They certainly used sealed spaces, blocking systems, and difficult architectural layouts. But that does not mean every strange feature inside the Great Pyramid was designed as a trap. The Grand Gallery may have played a role in protecting the upper chambers. It may have been connected to systems intended to block access, but there is no solid archaeological evidence that it was designed as a Hollywood-style death trap. No swinging blades, no poisoned needles. No hidden mechanical monster waiting in the darkness. The reality is more subtle, and perhaps more impressive. The ancient Egyptians may have relied on stone, geometry, engineering, and secrecy. Their defenses did not need to kill an intruder. They only needed to make entry difficult. A massive stone block could stop a thief. A sealed corridor could delay an intruder. A confusing route could conceal the destination. A hidden entrance could make discovery difficult, and fear could do the rest. Because imagine being an ancient tomb robber. You have entered a monument that was already thousands of years old. You are surrounded by stone. There is almost no light. You do not have a modern map. You do not know what is ahead. You may believe that disturbing the dead can bring consequences. And somewhere inside this enormous structure is the burial of one of the most powerful kings Egypt has ever known. That psychological atmosphere alone could have been terrifying. But there is something else. The Great Pyramid is not an ordinary building. Its sheer size creates a feeling that is difficult to explain. The stones around you are not walls in the ordinary sense. They are part of a mountain of masonry. Above you are enormous quantities of stone. Below you are more stones. Behind you are more stones. The outside world disappears. You are inside a structure that seems to have no end. And then you reach the Grand Gallery. The first people to see it after the ancient builders must have experienced something extraordinary. Today, we can study photographs, we can create digital models, we can measure every dimension. We can send instruments into spaces that were previously inaccessible. But imagine seeing the gallery without knowing what it was. No archaeological textbook, no modern explanation, no scientific equipment, only torchlight. The flame would move across the limestone. The walls would appear and disappear in shadow. The ceiling would seem to climb toward the darkness. Every sound would echo. A footstep would become something larger. A whisper could travel along the stone, and the further you climbed, the more isolated you would feel. Perhaps that is why the Grand Gallery has inspired so many theories. It looks unusual. It feels unusual. And when people encounter an ancient structure whose purpose is not completely understood, the imagination begins to fill the gaps. But the challenge of history is learning to resist that temptation. Mystery does not mean we can assume anything. Mystery means there are questions, and the Great Pyramid has plenty of them. We know that the Grand Gallery exists. We know its approximate dimensions. We know its architectural form. We know that it connects the ascending passage with the upper part of the pyramid. We know that the king's chamber lies beyond it. We know that unusual architectural features surround it. And we know that ancient builders invested enormous effort in creating it. What we do not know with absolute certainty is the complete story of its function. That distinction matters, because the most fascinating mysteries are not always the ones with supernatural explanations. Sometimes the most fascinating mystery is simply this: how did they do it? How did workers thousands of years ago construct such a space inside a pyramid? How did they calculate the angles? How did they transport and position the stones? How did they ensure that the structure remained stable? How did they coordinate the work? How did they know what had to be built first? And how did they create a passage whose architectural design still captures the imagination of engineers, archaeologists, and visitors today? The Great Pyramid was not built in a single moment. It was the result of years of planning and construction. Every layer depended on decisions made before it. Every chamber had to be positioned within the larger structure. Every passage had to be incorporated into the growing pyramid. And once the stonework covered a particular area, changing it would have been enormously difficult. This means the Grand Gallery had to be part of the plan. It was not something the builders simply decided to add at the last minute. Somewhere in the minds of the architects was a vision of the completed monument. They knew that a massive gallery would exist inside the pyramid. They knew that its walls would rise. They knew that its roof would be constructed in layers. They knew that it would lead toward the upper chambers. They knew that thousands of tons of stone would eventually surround it. And they built it anyway. That is what makes the Grand Gallery so compelling. The mystery is not simply what happened inside it. The mystery begins with the decision to create it. What problem were the builders trying to solve? What requirement did the gallery satisfy? Was it structural? Was it mechanical? Was it religious? Was it connected to the burial? Was it designed to help seal the pyramid? Or did several purposes exist at the same time? Ancient buildings rarely fit neatly into modern categories. A structure can be practical and symbolic at the same time. A corridor can carry people and also represent a religious journey. A chamber can support a physical function while also carrying spiritual meaning. The Great Pyramid may have been the same. And this is where the mystery becomes darker. Because if the Grand Gallery was connected in any way to the protection of the Pharaoh's burial, then the enormous passage may have been part of an ancient struggle between builders and thieves. The builders wanted the king protected. The thieves wanted the treasure. The monument became the battlefield. Stone became the weapon. Secrecy became the shield. And perhaps fear became the final defense. But did those defenses actually work? That question has a disturbing answer. At some point in antiquity, people entered the pyramid. The royal burial was not preserved in the condition its builders intended. Whatever treasures may have once been associated with Khufu's burial did not remain safely sealed until modern times. The ancient pyramid had been breached. The defenses had been overcome. The monument had been opened. And yet the mystery remained, because even after the robbers came, even after centuries passed, even after explorers entered the pyramid, the architecture continued to conceal parts of its story. Modern science has now entered the conversation. Researchers have used technologies that ancient explorers could never have imagined. Muon detection, digital scanning, robotic exploration, three-dimensional mapping. These methods have revealed that the Great Pyramid may still contain spaces whose full purpose is unknown, and that brings us back to the Grand Gallery. A passage that we can physically enter, a passage that we can measure, a passage that we can photograph, and yet one that still leaves fundamental questions unanswered. Perhaps the greatest secret of the Grand Gallery is not hidden behind a door. Perhaps it is hidden in the reason it exists. Tonight, we will follow that question deeper into the pyramid. We will examine the architecture. We will explore the engineering. We will look at the blocking systems. We will investigate the history of tomb robbery. We will uncover where the stories of curses came from. And we will ask whether the Grand Gallery was ever intended to be a defense against those who wanted to reach the Pharaoh. But before we can understand the gallery, we must understand the man whose pyramid it was built to protect, Khufu, a king whose reign belongs to one of the most extraordinary periods in ancient Egyptian history. A king who left behind one of the largest monuments ever constructed. A king whose burial remains uncertain. And a king whose pyramid still stands, waiting, silent, patient, as it has for thousands of years. And somewhere inside that stone monument is a passage unlike almost anything else from the ancient world. The Grand Gallery. Perhaps it was a doorway. Perhaps it was a machine. Perhaps it was part of a defense. Perhaps it was all of these things in different ways. Or perhaps there is still something about it that we do not understand. To find out, we must go back to the beginning. Back to the age when Khufu ruled Egypt. Back to the workers who shaped the limestone. Back to the architects who planned a monument that would outlive their civilization. And back to the moment when the first stone of the Great Pyramid was placed in the desert. Because before, there was a Grand Gallery, there was a king, and before, there was a mystery. There was a plan. Chapter 2. The House of Khufu. Long before the Great Pyramid became one of the most famous monuments on Earth, the Plateau of Giza was simply a place on the edge of the ancient Egyptian world. The desert stretched toward the horizon. The Nile flowed through the fertile land below, and somewhere between the river and the desert, a king imagined something that would challenge the limits of human construction. His name was Khufu to the ancient Egyptians. He was not simply a ruler. He was Pharaoh. The king stood at the center of Egyptian society. His authority was political. His authority was religious. And his death would not simply be the death of an individual. The Egyptians believed that the king's existence continued beyond death. The body had to be preserved. The burial had to be prepared. Rituals had to be performed. And the royal tomb had to become a place where the deceased ruler could continue his journey into eternity. This belief helps us understand why the Great Pyramid is so much more than a gigantic pile of stone. It was created for the dead, but it was also created for eternity. Khufu ruled during the 4th dynasty, a period when Egyptian pyramid construction reached an extraordinary level of scale and sophistication. His father, Sneferu, had already commissioned several enormous pyramid projects. Those earlier monuments were not simply failures or experiments. They were stages in a long process of architectural development. Egyptian builders had been learning. They had been testing angles. They had been dealing with structural problems. They had discovered the dangers of building too steeply. They had experimented with different forms, and with each generation, their understanding became more sophisticated. By the time Khufu came to power, Egypt had already developed a long tradition of monumental construction. But Khufu's project would push that tradition further than anything that had come before. The Great Pyramid would eventually rise more than 100 meters above the ground. Its original outer surface was covered with polished limestone casing stones. From a distance, the completed monument would have appeared remarkably different from what we see today. The rough, stepped appearance of exposed core blocks was not how the pyramid originally looked. The ancient monument was smoother, brighter, more reflective. Under the Egyptian sun, the polished limestone would have transformed the pyramid into something almost luminous. And at the center of this enormous structure was the king's burial. At least, that was the intended purpose. But the builders faced a difficult problem. How do you create a tomb worthy of a king who believed he would live forever? The answer was not simply to dig a hole and place a body inside it. The entire monument had to participate in the royal burial. The pyramid complex had to connect the king with the gods. Its orientation mattered. Its proportions mattered. Its temples mattered. The internal chambers mattered. And the journey through the monument itself may have had meaning. Ancient Egyptian religion was deeply connected to the movement of the sun. The sun rose in the east. It traveled across the sky, and it disappeared in the west. Death was not necessarily imagined as a simple ending. It was part of a cosmic cycle. The pharaoh's journey after death was connected to the divine order of the universe. This helps explain why pyramids were associated with more than physical burial. They were monuments of transformation. The dead king was expected to become something more. The pyramid pointed upward. Its shape rose toward the heavens. And the king's eternal existence was connected with the stars and the divine realm. But there was another practical problem. The body had to remain safe. A tomb filled with valuable objects was an invitation to thieves. The ancient Egyptians understood this. They had already experienced the problem. Royal burials could contain enormous wealth. Precious metals, stone vessels, jewelry, ceremonial objects, furniture, weapons, clothing, offerings, objects representing the status and identity of the deceased. These were not merely decorations. They were part of the burial environment, but to a thief, they were a fortune. And the larger the royal monument became, the greater the temptation. This creates an interesting contradiction at the heart of Egyptian royal architecture. The pharaoh wanted to be remembered forever, but the more impressive the tomb became, the more attention it attracted. The pyramid announced the king's power to the entire world. At the same time, that announcement could also reveal the location of enormous wealth. The builders therefore had to solve two problems at once. The monument needed to proclaim the pharaoh's greatness, and the burial needed to remain protected. This may be one reason the interior of the Great Pyramid is so fascinating. The outside is monumental. The inside is surprisingly controlled. Long passages, narrow corridors, large chambers, sudden changes in height, heavy stone, restricted movement, and then the grand gallery. The architectural complexity is not random. It reflects decisions. The builders knew where they wanted certain spaces. They knew which passages needed to rise. They knew where the chambers needed to be located, and they knew that enormous quantities of stone would surround those spaces. Imagine the planning involved. The workers were not constructing an empty pyramid and then carving a building inside it. Much of the internal structure had to be planned as the pyramid grew. A mistake could become permanent. A miscalculation could be buried beneath thousands of tons of stone. The architects, therefore, had to think in 3 dimensions. They had to understand the pyramid as both an external monument and an internal machine of spaces. The Grand Gallery is one of the clearest examples of this complexity. It is not simply a hallway. Its design is extraordinary. Its floor rises steeply. Its walls are tall. Its ceiling is formed by layers of stone that project inward. This technique is called corbelling. Instead of placing a single flat roof across a wide opening, the builders gradually shifted stones inward from both sides. Each layer extends slightly farther toward the center. Eventually, the 2 sides approach each other. The result is a tall, narrow space with an impressive ceiling. But this was not merely an aesthetic decision. Stone behaves according to physical laws. Weight creates pressure. Pressure must be transferred. A poorly designed roof can collapse. Inside the Great Pyramid, the consequences of failure would have been enormous. The Grand Gallery, therefore, represents an engineering achievement. But perhaps it also represents something else: control. The builders controlled the movement of people through the pyramid. A visitor could not simply walk directly from the entrance to the king's chamber. The route was complicated. The original entrance led downward. A passage moved into the interior. Then another passage rose. The route changed. The spaces changed. And eventually the traveler encountered the Grand Gallery. This sequence creates a journey. Whether that journey was deliberately symbolic or primarily architectural remains a subject of discussion. But the experience would have been powerful. And there was another important feature. The Great Pyramid's internal architecture did not make the burial chamber immediately obvious. This is important when we think about security. If you are trying to protect something, one strategy is simple. Do not make it easy to find. The Great Pyramid contains spaces that do not provide a straightforward route to the king's chamber. There is the subterranean chamber. There, is the Queen's Chamber. There are passages and shafts. There are changes in direction. There are blocking stones. The monument is not designed like a modern building with a clear corridor leading directly to the main room. It is more complicated. But we must be careful. Complexity does not automatically mean deliberate anti-robbery design. Some features may have structural explanations. Others may have religious meanings. Some may have been connected to the construction process itself. The ancient builders had several problems to solve simultaneously. They had to construct a stable monument. They had to create a royal burial environment. They had to connect spaces within the pyramid. They had to deal with enormous weight. And they may also have needed to restrict access. The Grand Gallery could therefore have had more than one function. This is one of the most important ideas to remember as we explore the pyramid. Ancient architecture does not always fit modern categories. We tend to ask, was it structural or religious or defensive? But the ancient Egyptians may not have separated those ideas in the same way. A structure could be functional and sacred. A passage could be practical and symbolic. A chamber could serve a mechanical purpose while also participating in the royal burial. The pyramid was an integrated system, and the Grand Gallery was part of that system. But who actually built it? For a long time, popular stories imagined the pyramids being constructed by vast armies of enslaved people. The image is familiar. Endless rows of slaves, dragging enormous blocks beneath the command of cruel overseers. But archaeological evidence provides a more complicated picture. Excavations around the Giza Plateau have revealed evidence of an organized workforce. Workers lived near the construction area. They needed food. They needed housing. They needed tools. They needed medical care. They needed administration. Building the Great Pyramid required enormous coordination. Stone had to be quarried, transported, shaped, positioned, and integrated into the structure. Different groups had different responsibilities. Some workers were skilled craftsmen. Others handled transportation. Others prepared food. Others maintained tools. Others managed logistics. The pyramid was effectively a gigantic national project. And behind it was an enormous administrative system. This is important because it changes how we understand the monument. The Great Pyramid was not simply the product of brute strength. It was the product of organization. Thousands of individual tasks had to happen in the correct sequence. A stone block could not be placed until the structure beneath it was ready. A passage could not be sealed until workers no longer needed access. An internal chamber could not be completed after the surrounding structure had closed. The builders therefore had to think ahead, far ahead. They were constructing a monument whose final form would not be visible for years. Somewhere within that growing mass of stone, they were also constructing the Grand Gallery. Imagine standing on the construction site during the early stages. The pyramid is rising. The desert is filled with activity. Workers are moving stone. Supervisors are coordinating teams. Craftsmen are cutting blocks. And somewhere inside the rising monument, the framework of the future gallery is taking shape. At this stage, the gallery would not look mysterious. It would be a construction project, a planned space, a set of walls and stones that had to be positioned exactly. But once the pyramid was completed, the workers would disappear. The ramps would disappear. The construction platforms would disappear. The tools would be removed. The entrances would be closed. and the living world would gradually move away from the monument. The pyramid would become what its builders intended it to become: a house for the dead king, and perhaps a monument to eternity. But eternity has a problem. Humans do not remain gone forever. Someone eventually comes looking, and the people who came looking at the Great Pyramid were not always archaeologists. Long before modern science arrived in Egypt, people had already entered the monument. Some may have entered legally, others may have entered secretly. Some may have been explorers, others may have been thieves. The pyramid had survived for centuries, but it had not remained untouched. The original burial arrangements were not preserved perfectly. The pyramid had been penetrated, its internal spaces had been entered, and somewhere along the way, the original security system had failed. That is where the story becomes darker. Because if the pyramid was designed to protect the pharaoh, who defeated the protection? And how? Did ancient robbers find the original entrance? Did they discover another route? Did they break through stone? Did they bypass blocking systems? Did they understand the architecture well enough to navigate it? Or did the pyramid itself reveal its secrets over time? We may never know exactly what happened, but the evidence of ancient intrusion tells us something important. The pyramid's builders were not working in an imaginary world. They were dealing with a real human problem. The dead could be disturbed. The tomb could be robbed. The sacred could be violated. And no matter how powerful the pharaoh had been in life, his burial could not defend itself forever. Perhaps that is why the idea of curses became so attractive in later generations. If stone could fail, perhaps magic could succeed. If thieves could overcome a physical barrier, perhaps a supernatural warning could stop them. The idea of a curse creates another layer of protection, fear. But the origins of Egyptian curses are complicated. Not every warning found in an Egyptian tomb was a magical threat. Many inscriptions were religious. Some were concerned with maintaining offerings. Some invoked gods. Some warned against violating sacred spaces. And later generations transformed these ideas into the dramatic legend of the Pharaoh's curse. The popular image is familiar. A tomb is opened. The explorers disturb the dead. Then disaster follows. Illness, death, bad luck, mysterious events. But the historical reality is much more complicated. The Great Pyramid itself does not contain the kind of elaborate curse inscription that modern movies often portray. The real mystery is architectural, and that mystery is enough. Because when we stand inside the Great Pyramid, we are standing inside a structure created by people who understood stone in ways that still impress us. They built upward. They built inward. They created spaces that had to survive enormous pressure. And they created a passage that seems almost oversized compared with the narrow corridors around it. The Grand Gallery. Why so large? Why so tall? Why so carefully constructed? Why does it rise toward the upper chambers? And why does its architecture contain features that have inspired theories about blocking mechanisms and construction systems? These questions have occupied explorers and researchers for centuries, and every generation has brought new tools. Every new tool has revealed something, but no tool has yet produced a simple answer. Perhaps that is because the pyramid was designed to be simple from the outside and complex within. The outside tells us who built it, The inside asks us why, and the deeper we go, the more questions appear. Khufu wanted a monument that would carry his name into eternity. His builders gave him something even greater. They created a structure that outlived the civilization that built it. And inside that structure, they created the Grand Gallery, a place that may have helped connect the living world to the dead, a place that may have played a role in construction, a place that may have been involved in securing the upper chambers, a place whose exact purpose remains debated. The pharaoh's body may be gone, the treasures may be gone, the original rituals may be gone, but the architecture remains. And perhaps the greatest irony is that the people who built the pyramid wanted to preserve the pharaoh forever. Instead, they preserved something else. A mystery, a question carved into stone. What was the Grand Gallery really for? To answer that, we must stop looking at the pyramid from the outside. We must enter it. We must follow the passages. We must descend into darkness, then climb again. We must pass the places where ancient builders deliberately changed the shape of the monument. And eventually, we must stand at the beginning of the Grand Gallery, because the journey itself may hold the first clue. The entrance waits in darkness. The passage descends. The stone closes around us, and somewhere ahead, the ceiling begins to rise. The Grand Gallery is waiting. Chapter 3. Entering the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid looks different from the inside. From the outside, it is enormous. Its shape is immediately recognizable. 4 sides rise toward the sky, meeting at a summit that once stood higher than almost anything else built by human hands. But the outside does not prepare you for the interior. There is no grand entrance hall, no wide staircase, no enormous doorway announcing the path toward the pharaoh. Instead, the journey begins with darkness. The original entrance of the Great Pyramid is positioned high on the northern face. Today, visitors enter through a passage associated with an opening made in antiquity, while the original entrance remains part of the monument's complicated history. For the ancient visitor, however, entering the pyramid would have been an entirely different experience. There were no electric lights, no signs, no protective railings, no guides explaining what waited ahead. There was only stone and darkness. Imagine standing before the entrance thousands of years ago. The pyramid rises above you. You know that somewhere inside is the burial of the king. You know that the monument is sacred. You may also know that the passage ahead was never meant to be an ordinary public hallway. You step forward. The light begins to disappear. The desert is behind you. The sky is behind you. The warmth of the sun is behind you. With every step, the pyramids surround you more completely. The first major passage leads downward. The descending passage is one of the most remarkable features of the pyramid's internal design. It cuts downward through the stone at a deliberate angle. The passage is relatively narrow. A person moving through it would not be able to walk comfortably upright for long stretches. The walls are close. The ceiling is low. The journey is physically restrictive. And this creates an immediate psychological effect. You are not walking through a palace. You are entering something that feels buried. The pyramid may rise toward the sky outside, but inside, your first movement is downward. That contrast is striking. The monument points upward. The passage takes you beneath it. Why? There are many possible explanations. The subterranean chamber may have been part of the original architectural plan. The internal design may have evolved during construction. The builders may have changed their plans as the pyramid developed. The exact sequence of decisions remains one of the fascinating questions surrounding the monument. But there is another feature that makes the descending passage important. It reminds us that the Great Pyramid was not constructed as one simple room surrounded by stone. It was a complex system. Passages had different orientations. Chambers were positioned at different levels. Some spaces were above ground, others were below. Some passages were horizontal, others were steeply inclined. The builders were creating an internal architecture within an enormous external structure, and they had to make all of it work together. Imagine the difficulty. The pyramid was growing layer by layer. Every stone added to the outside increased the pressure on the interior. The builders had to maintain alignment. They had to know where the passages were. They had to know where the chambers would be. And they had to make sure the monument remained stable. A modern architect could draw the entire structure on a computer. The ancient Egyptians did not have that luxury. They relied on practical mathematics, surveying, experience, and organization. Their methods may have been different from ours, but the result demonstrates extraordinary competence. The descending passage eventually reaches the lower part of the pyramid. Here, the architecture becomes even stranger. Beneath the main body of the pyramid lies the subterranean chamber. It is unfinished. Its rough surfaces contrast sharply with the carefully constructed spaces higher in the pyramid. This unfinished chamber has generated many theories. Was it part of an earlier plan? Was the original burial supposed to be underground? Was construction abandoned here when the architects changed their design? Or was the chamber intentionally left unfinished? We cannot answer every question with certainty, but the chamber gives us an important clue about the history of the pyramid. The Great Pyramid may not have been built according to one perfectly fixed plan from beginning to end. The design appears to have changed, and that possibility is crucial because the Grand Gallery may have been connected to this evolving design. The pyramid's architects may have begun with one concept, then developed another, then created additional spaces as the monument grew. The final pyramid was therefore the result of decisions made over time. That makes its internal architecture even more fascinating. The builders were not simply following a single, simple blueprint. They were solving problems. And sometimes, solving one problem creates another. If a burial chamber is moved higher, the passage system must change. If the pyramid's internal layout changes, the weight distribution changes. If the burial needs additional protection, the builders must create new barriers. If the monument must remain structurally stable, the chambers require different support. The Great Pyramid is therefore a story of adaptation, and adaptation is one of the keys to understanding the mysterious spaces inside it. At some point, the builders decided that the burial complex needed to rise higher. The architecture began to move upward. A passage was created that would eventually lead toward the upper chambers. This is the ascending passage. The contrast is dramatic. You have descended into the pyramid. Now you must climb. The passage rises through the stone, but the path does not simply open into a great chamber. Instead, it remains narrow. And somewhere along this route, Enormous blocking stones became part of the architecture. These blocks are among the most important clues when we discuss pyramid security. Because if the Egyptians wanted to prevent access, massive stone was an obvious solution. No complicated metal lock was required. No mechanical keypad. No electronic alarm. Stone was enough. A block weighing many tons could make a passage extremely difficult to enter, and once the pyramid was sealed, moving such a block would require enormous effort. But there is an important question. Were these blocks originally intended to stop robbers, or were they part of the construction and sealing process associated with the burial? The answer may involve both. Ancient Egyptian tombs were designed to protect the dead, so sealing systems clearly had a security purpose. But their exact design may have been influenced by structural and ritual requirements as well. The builders had to think about how the monument would be closed. They had to think about how the burial would be protected. They had to think about how the passages would function during construction. And they had to think about how the structure would behave after the workers were gone. This is where the idea of a trap becomes tempting. Imagine a thief entering the pyramid. He finds a passage. He moves upward. Then he encounters a massive stone blocking the route. He searches for a way around it. Perhaps another route exists. Perhaps there is a hidden passage. Perhaps there is no easy solution. From the thief's perspective, the pyramid itself becomes an opponent. But we should be careful about the word trap. A trap implies a mechanism deliberately designed to injure or kill. The Great Pyramid provides evidence for barriers and blocking systems, but evidence for elaborate, lethal traps is much weaker. The real defensive strategy may have been simpler. Make the tomb difficult to enter. Make the route difficult to understand. Make the burial chamber difficult to reach. And conceal the most important spaces within an enormous structure. That may have been enough. But the ancient Egyptians faced another problem. What happens when a thief is willing to break the rules? What happens when someone is not afraid of the gods? What happens when someone knows the value of what is inside? This was the world of tomb robbery. And tomb robbery was not merely a modern fantasy. It happened. Ancient Egypt left evidence of it. Royal tombs were vulnerable. Even elaborate burial systems could be defeated. The Great Pyramid was no exception. But before we think about the thieves, we need to understand the journey they or any intruder would have faced. The ascending passage eventually leads toward a remarkable transition. The narrow corridor opens into a larger space. The ceiling rises. The walls change. The architecture suddenly becomes monumental again. The Grand Gallery. But before reaching it, there is another important feature. The passage is connected with the arrangement of large stones that restrict movement. This is where the pyramid begins to feel almost mechanical. The builders were not simply creating rooms. They were creating controlled pathways. The movement of a person through the pyramid could be directed. You could go down. You could go up. You could be blocked. You could be redirected. The monument controlled access. And this is one reason some researchers have wondered whether the Grand Gallery itself may have played a role in a larger sealing mechanism. The gallery is large enough to accommodate complicated arrangements. Its architecture is unusual. Its relationship to the upper chambers is significant, and features within and around it suggest that the builders had practical reasons for creating such a space. But again, we must distinguish what we know from what we imagine. The Great Pyramid is mysterious enough without inventing mechanisms that archaeology has never demonstrated. There is no need to claim that ancient Egyptians created a hidden machine capable of crushing anyone who entered. The stones themselves were already powerful. A sealed passage could be enough. A massive block could be enough. A confusing layout could be enough. And, perhaps most importantly, secrecy could be enough. The best security system is sometimes the one nobody knows exists. The ancient Egyptians understood concealment. Royal burials could be hidden. Entrances could be disguised. Sacred spaces could be restricted. And the deeper an intruder went into the pyramid, the more difficult the environment became. The temperature changed. The light disappeared. The passages narrowed. Orientation became difficult. The enormous weight of the monument surrounded you. The psychological pressure must have been intense. But then something unexpected happens. The passage opens. The ceiling rises. The cramped feeling begins to disappear. You enter a space that is almost theatrical. The Grand Gallery. It is approximately 47 meters long. Its floor rises steeply. Its walls are tall. Its roof is built with corbelled layers of limestone. The difference between the Grand Gallery and the passages around it is dramatic. Why would the builders create such a large interior space? If the only purpose was to move people from one passage to another, why make it so monumental? That is one of the central questions. The Grand Gallery is too impressive to ignore. Its design required substantial effort. Its construction had to be coordinated with the surrounding pyramid, and the stones had to remain stable under enormous pressure. The walls contain ledges. The roof rises in layers. The space appears carefully proportioned. Everything about it suggests deliberate design. But deliberate design does not automatically tell us the purpose. A building can be carefully designed for reasons we no longer understand. That is the challenge of archaeology. We see the object. We can measure it. We can examine the materials. We can compare it with other monuments. But the builders are no longer here to explain their decisions. They left no detailed engineering manual, no surviving document says. This is the Grand Gallery. We built it for this exact reason. Instead, we have to reconstruct the story from evidence, stone by stone, feature by feature, comparison by comparison. And sometimes the evidence allows several possibilities. Perhaps the Grand Gallery was related to the movement of massive blocks. Perhaps it was part of the process of sealing the upper chambers. Perhaps it had a religious function. Perhaps it served multiple purposes. One possibility that has attracted particular attention is the relationship between the Grand Gallery and the so-called portcullis system near the king's chamber. The upper part of the pyramid contains granite structures that appear to have been involved in blocking access. Massive stone slabs could be positioned in ways that made passage extremely difficult. The exact operation of these systems is still discussed, but the principle is straightforward. The pharaoh's burial needed protection. The architects had to create a way to close the route, and the Grand Gallery may have provided the space necessary for such an arrangement. This possibility gives the gallery a darker dimension. Perhaps the space was never intended to be a welcoming passage. Perhaps it was part of the final act of the burial. Workers entered. They completed their tasks. The king was placed inside. The burial rituals were performed. Then the pyramid was sealed. The workers left. And the pharaoh was supposed to remain alone forever. Imagine the final moment. The last workers inside the pyramid. The torches burning. The air still. The stone passages illuminated by flickering light. The king's chamber sealed. The paths closed. The burial protected. The final people walk away. The entrance is closed. And the pyramid becomes silent. At that moment, the Grand Gallery may have been part of a system whose purpose was to ensure that nobody would follow. But eventually, someone did. The pyramid was entered. The barriers were bypassed. The ancient security system failed, and the people who entered may have discovered something the builders hoped nobody would see. The empty burial chamber, the remains of an ancient royal burial. Or perhaps nothing at all. We do not know exactly what ancient robbers encountered, but the fact that the pyramid was entered tells us something important. The architects did not create an impenetrable fortress. They created a monument that was difficult to enter, and difficult is not the same as impossible. Over centuries, human ingenuity can overcome stone. A determined thief can break through a wall. A hidden route can be discovered. A blocking stone can be bypassed. A secret can eventually become known. That is why the story of the pyramid is also a story of time. The builders thought in terms of eternity. The thieves thought in terms of opportunity. The archaeologists thought in terms of evidence. And we stand between them, trying to understand what happened. The Grand Gallery remains. Its stones have survived. Its roof still rises above the path. Its ledges still run along the walls. Its steep floor still climbs toward the upper chambers. The people who designed it are gone. The people who built it are gone. The people who may have sealed it are gone. And the people who eventually broke into the pyramid are gone. But their work remains. And that is what makes the next part of our journey so important. Because the Grand Gallery is not simply a strange room. It may be a clue to how the Egyptians solved one of the greatest problems facing a royal tomb. How do you protect something that is meant to last forever? The answer may be hidden in the architecture, in the stones, in the blocking systems, in the strange geometry of the gallery, and perhaps in the silence between them. But before we can understand the gallery's possible role as a defense, we need to climb it. We need to look carefully at every feature, the ledges, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, the spaces around it, and the passages beyond it. Because sometimes the most important clues are not hidden behind a secret door. They are sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Why did the Egyptians build the Grand Gallery this way? And what happened when the pyramid finally closed? The answer may take us closer to the ancient Pharaoh than we have ever been, but it may also take us into the darkest part of the story. The moment when the pyramid was sealed and the dead king was left behind. End note. For more than 4,000 years, the Great Pyramid has stood beneath the Egyptian sky. Its builders are gone. Its king is gone. The priests who performed the ancient rituals are gone. The workers who carried and shaped the limestone are gone. Even the civilization that created this extraordinary monument has changed beyond recognition. And yet the pyramid remains, silent, massive, watching over the desert as it has done for countless generations. Inside that enormous structure is a passage that continues to capture the imagination of the world, the Grand Gallery. At first glance, it is simply a remarkable architectural space, a steep passage rising through the heart of the pyramid. Tall walls, corbelled layers of limestone, a carefully engineered ceiling, a dramatic transition from the narrow passages below. But when we ask why it was built, the simple answer disappears. Perhaps it was connected to the engineering of the upper chambers. Perhaps it helped the builders manage enormous stones. Perhaps it played a role in a system designed to seal and protect the king's chamber. Perhaps it had religious significance. Perhaps several of these explanations are true at the same time. And perhaps there are details we still do not fully understand. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is what makes the Great Pyramid so fascinating. History is not always a story in which every question has a neat ending. Sometimes the evidence gives us part of the answer. Sometimes it gives us several possibilities. And sometimes the stones simply remain silent. The Grand Gallery has inspired stories of traps, stories of secret mechanisms, stories of curses, stories of hidden treasures and mysterious powers. But the real history is already extraordinary enough. The ancient Egyptians did not need supernatural machines to make the pyramid difficult to enter. They had stone. They had geometry. They had enormous scale. They had carefully planned passages. They had massive blocking systems. And they had the ability to hide a royal burial inside one of the largest structures ever constructed. Their greatest defense may have been the monument itself. A thief entering the pyramid would have entered a world completely different from the desert outside. There would be darkness, confusion, narrow corridors, heavy stone, unknown passages, and the knowledge that somewhere inside was the burial of a powerful king. The pyramid could intimidate without moving a single stone. It could create fear without a single curse. It could protect through architecture alone. And yet, eventually, the pyramid was entered. The ancient robbers remind us of something important. Nothing created by humans is completely beyond human reach. The builders imagined eternity. The thieves found opportunities. The monument survived both. Perhaps the greatest tragedy for the ancient Egyptians was that the protection they created did not last exactly as they intended. But perhaps the greatest achievement was that so much of the monument survived at all. The treasures may have disappeared. The original burial may have vanished. The ancient rituals have become fragments of history. But the architecture remains. And because it remains, we can still ask questions. We can still study the stones. We can still measure the passages. We can still investigate the engineering. We can still use technologies that the ancient builders could never have imagined. Modern researchers have begun looking inside the Great Pyramid in ways that earlier explorers could not. Scanners can detect changes in density. Robots can enter narrow spaces. Digital models can reconstruct areas hidden from direct observation. And techniques such as muon scanning have revealed evidence of previously unknown spaces within the monument. The pyramid continues to surprise us. That may be its greatest secret. It was built thousands of years ago, yet it is still capable of producing new discoveries. The builders could never have imagined a world in which their monument would be studied by satellites, robots, and advanced scanning equipment. They could never have imagined that people thousands of years later would still debate the purpose of a single gallery inside their creation. And they certainly could not have imagined that the questions surrounding the Grand Gallery would become part of a global fascination with ancient Egypt. But perhaps they understood something about human nature. People are drawn to what they cannot completely explain. A sealed chamber, a hidden passage, a massive stone block, a mysterious corridor, a forgotten inscription. These things invite questions, and the Great Pyramid is filled with them. The Grand Gallery is one of the greatest examples. It does not scream its purpose. It does not provide an obvious explanation. It simply exists, a massive architectural space inside an enormous monument. And perhaps that is why so many theories have appeared around it. When evidence is incomplete, imagination tries to finish the story. Some theories become popular, others disappear. New discoveries replace old assumptions, and sometimes an old question survives for centuries. Why? Why was the Grand Gallery built? We may one day discover evidence that provides a more complete answer. A new scan? A hidden feature. A previously overlooked architectural detail. A discovery in another Egyptian monument that helps explain the Great Pyramid. Or perhaps the complete answer has already been lost forever. The people who knew exactly why the Grand Gallery was built are no longer here. Their voices have disappeared. Their plans have disappeared. Their construction records have disappeared. But they left something behind that is almost as powerful as a written explanation. They left the structure itself. The stones are evidence. The measurements are evidence. The architecture is evidence. Every angle tells us something. Every passage tells us something. Every chamber tells us something. And the Grand Gallery is still waiting to be understood. There is another lesson hidden inside this mystery. The ancient Egyptians are sometimes presented as people surrounded by superstition and mystery. But the Great Pyramid reveals something much more impressive. They were engineers, organizers, surveyors, builders, craftsmen, architects. They understood materials. They understood weight. They understood geometry. They understood how to coordinate enormous projects. And they created a monument that has survived longer than almost any other monumental structure from the ancient world. That achievement deserves to be remembered without needing to turn every unknown into something supernatural. The mystery is powerful enough on its own. We do not need to invent a deadly trap. We do not need to imagine a magical curse. We do not need to claim that every unexplained feature has a hidden supernatural purpose. The truth is already astonishing. Human beings built the Great Pyramid with ancient tools and ancient knowledge. They created an enormous monument whose internal architecture still challenges researchers. They built a gallery whose precise purpose remains a subject of investigation. And they did all of this more than 4,000 years ago. Perhaps the most terrifying thing about the pyramid is not what might be inside. It is the realization that an ancient civilization could create something so enormous, so precise, and so enduring that thousands of years later, we are still trying to understand it. The Pharaoh has disappeared. The builders have disappeared. The priests have disappeared. The thieves have disappeared. But the pyramid remains, and so does the Grand Gallery. Imagine standing there again, The lights are gone. The modern world is far away. The limestone walls rise around you. The ceiling stretches into darkness. Your footsteps echo through a passage created by people whose names we may never know. They built this place, believing that it would survive. And they were right. You stand beneath stones placed by human hands more than 4,000 years ago. For a moment, the distance between the ancient world and the modern world disappears. The pyramid is no longer simply an archaeological site. It becomes a message written not in words, but in stone. We were here. We built this. We believed it would last, and it did. Perhaps someday we will understand every secret of the Grand Gallery. Perhaps we will discover another hidden space. Perhaps a new technology will reveal something that changes our interpretation of the pyramid. Or perhaps the Grand Gallery will continue to resist a final explanation. And maybe that is appropriate, because some mysteries are not meant to end with a single answer. They are meant to keep us looking, keep us questioning, keep us exploring. The Great Pyramid began as the monument of one king, but it became something much larger. It became a monument to human ambition, a monument to engineering, a monument to belief, and, eventually, a monument to mystery. The Grand Gallery stands at the center of that mystery. It may have been a pathway, a structural solution, a construction feature, a defensive component, a religious space, or some combination of purposes that we are only beginning to understand. Whatever the final answer may be, one fact remains. The people who built it knew exactly what they were doing. They planned it, they measured it, they shaped it, they placed the stones, and then they left. Thousands of years later, we are still here, still climbing, still looking, still asking, what was the Grand Gallery really built to do? Maybe the answer is hidden somewhere beyond the stones. Maybe it is waiting in another chamber. Maybe it is buried in an ancient record we have not yet found. Or maybe the answer has been lost to time. But the question remains, and as long as the Great Pyramid stands beneath the Egyptian sky, the question will remain with it. The desert becomes quiet again. The stars appear above Giza. The pyramid becomes a dark silhouette against the night. Inside, the Grand Gallery disappears into darkness. No footsteps, no voices, no ancient torches, only stone. 4,000 years of silence. And somewhere within that silence is a story that began with a pharaoh, continued with thousands of builders, survived the thieves, challenged generations of explorers, and still refuses to reveal every secret. The Great Pyramid has survived because it was built to endure. The Grand Gallery has survived because its builders understood something fundamental about stone. But perhaps it has also survived because we still do not fully understand it. And maybe that is the greatest mystery of all. Not what the pyramid is hiding from us, but what it is still waiting for us to discover.